Sometimes in life, we're presented with information or visuals that don't quite add up. And then when something weird happens that doesn't go the way we expect, we don't know how to make sense of it. Until somebody comes along that helps to reorient our vision and to see that what we thought was upside down was actually putting things right side up again. Turns out that's what Jesus is doing all the time. It's especially true in the 10th chapter of Mark's Gospel that we'll be taking a look at today in this conversation of meeting Jesus. As we've been seeing all throughout Mark's Gospel, Jesus has a way of taking people's expectations and flipping them 180 degrees on their head. And to hear Jesus tell it, he's come to give us right side up vision, to show us how God has intended to be doing things all along. But to everybody else, it feels like he's taking their usual expectations and just flipping them upside down. He's done that already when he's begun to tell his disciples that his way of being God's chosen, God's anointed, God's Messiah or Christ isn't to be the conquering king who destroys his enemies, but who lays down his life in suffering love. And that this isn't an accident or a cosmic tragedy when it happens. This is God's way of reigning, is suffering love. That blows their mind. So Jesus, again, as we get further into chapter 10 in Mark's Gospel, for a third time tells his disciples, I want you to know we're headed toward Jerusalem, and there, the Son of Man, this is Jesus' preferred title for himself. Jesus says the Son of Man will be betrayed into the hands of the religious leaders and the empire, and will be crucified and will rise again on the third day. And again, they just don't understand it. Part of why this is so difficult isn't that Jesus' words are hard to understand, but that they're trying to make sense of something that doesn't add up. Like when you're looking at a picture and don't realize it's upside down until somebody helps give you the reference point and you can see, oh, I've been seeing things upside down all this time. Similarly, the next scene we get has James and John, two of Jesus' inner circle of disciples. They are two of the guys who've gone up with him up on the mountaintop when he's transfigured, and they ask if they can have the spots at Jesus' right hand and left hand when he comes in his glory, right? They imagine that Jesus, again, sort of like an emperor figure, when he comes into his ascendancy into power and finally is coronated and is king of the universe, that they want to be his number one and number two executive vice presidents, right? They imagine that the spots at Jesus' right and left hand are his places in glory, and Jesus has to say to them, you don't understand what you're asking. And his figurative way of responding is, can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? Can you be baptized for the baptism I'm going to have to endure? And they insist, oh, we totally can, Jesus. And of course, Jesus says back, well, you are going to follow in my path, but I can't give you the spots at my right and my left hand. Hold on to that thought. We're going to need to come back to it about who ends up occupying the places at Jesus' right and left hand. But in the meantime, the other disciples are all upset that James and John have had this idea to vie for the number one and number two spots in Jesus' entourage. And Jesus stops them all and goes, okay, we need to be clear about something. You know that in the rest of the world, among the Gentiles, their kings are tyrants over them. Their great ones are despots over them. They lord it over their underlings. And then Jesus says something really powerful, but it is not so among you. Not conditional, it doesn't have to be that way, or it might not be that way, or you don't have to do it that way. Jesus says it isn't so among you. In God's reign, in the kind of order of things that I'm bringing to you, that's not how we do things. In the reign of God, if you want to be great, you put yourself in the lowest position. If you want to be the first, you have to put yourself in the role of servant, in the role of last. Jesus is turning things on their head and saying, this is how things are supposed to be all along. I'm putting things right side up again. You all have just gotten so used to things being upside down, you can't understand what I'm saying. So Jesus not only says his way of saving is to do this upside down, unexpected, laying down his life rather than conquering his enemies. He says his followers are called into that way of life too. And then he gives this final line as himself as the example for the Son of Man. Again, that's Jesus' description of himself. Didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. In other words, there's a thread of consistency between Jesus' way of embodying God's reign and our way of living it out. Jesus takes the position of lowliness, and that's not an exception. That's the common thread, so that our way of being leaders or our ways of being great is always to put ourselves in that position of how do we serve? How do we lift up those who are lowly, those who have been treated like they don't matter? This is the way God does things. And if it feels to us like it's turning things upside down and messing up our ordinary order of things, Jesus would just say he's come to put things right side back up again, and then to help our eyes adjust to seeing things the right way. All of a sudden, the things that Jesus says and does make sense because it turns out we've been seeing them upside down. He's been doing things right side up all along. And maybe as sort of icing on the cake to all this piece about seeing things in a new way, Mark gives us a final sort of bookend about seeing things clearly with another healing of somebody who is blind. We get the story of Bartimaeus, who recognizes Jesus, who calls out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." In other words, he recognizes Jesus using this messianic title, right? So even though the disciples have been left scratching their heads, did we bet on the wrong horse? Is Jesus not really the Messiah because he's not what we expected? Bartimaeus, whose eyes don't function, he still sees more perceptively than the disciples do. And he asks for healing, and Jesus heals him in one instant. It was sort of like a bookend. Back before Jesus' famous conversation with disciples about who he is, there had been that weird healing moment where it took sort of two stages for the person to be healed. And we might have said before, Mark may be deliberately bookending these as sort of, sometimes it takes sort of a twofold way. Sometimes clarity emerges slowly over time, like in this healing story. But now finally, we've come through this place where Jesus tells his disciples he's the Messiah, but not the way they expect. His way of being the Messiah is suffering, love, a cross, and resurrection. And that they are called to that kind of way in the world of suffering love, of putting themselves in the position of servant leaders rather than tyrants who lord it over their subjects. So now we get this final healing, this restoration of sight for Bartimaeus, who already sees Jesus more perceptively than Jesus' own disciples have. As we've been taking a look throughout Mark's gospel, you might have noticed there's been this running list of people who recognize Jesus that you wouldn't expect, right? The demons recognize Jesus, but the religious leaders don't. The blind man sees who Jesus is, even though his eyes don't work, but Jesus' own disciples are confused about who he is or his identity. That's part of the delightful reversal going on, but really what it is it's Jesus putting things right side up and letting our eyes, both our literal eyes and our spiritual vision, readjust as we see that Jesus has come to put things right side up. So that's what we're going to be covering in this coming week's conversation in Meeting Jesus. We're always meeting at 1 o'clock on Thursdays here at Community of Christ in person, but you're of course also welcome to join us just by catching up with these video sessions all along. I hope that if you continue to join us here, you'll continue to find Jesus meeting you where you are and adjusting all of our vision. See you next time.